Upagraha, or demi-planets of classical Vedic astrology, are super interesting and super underexplored and underutilized. In this video, I'll teach you exactly what they are, where they are, and how to interpret them in any house or in conjunction with any planet. So the term demi-planet is a translation of Upagraha, which is a word that means something that is sort of like a planet, almost a planet, or has some direct relationship or correlation to a planet. There are two categories of demi-planets. There are the invisible or non-luminous demi-planets, and then there are the periodic demi-planets. Now there's 5 demi-planets in each category, so there's a total of 10 additional points that we can utilize on a chart, which is a whole lot of additional points. So that should make people who are coming from modern astrology feel comfortable, since they're kind of used to all these asteroids and outer planets and things like that. Now the truth is, all of these demi-planets are invisible. They're not physical bodies floating around in space. But there's a particular good reason why the periodic demi-planets are set aside in a class of their own. I'll explain that later when we get to them. First thing I would like to do is describe and understand the invisible demi-planets. So here are the names of the 5 invisible demi-planets, the Prakash Upagraha. There's Dhuma, the smoky, Vyatipata, the contemptuous, Parivesh, the encircler, Indrachapa, the king's bow, and Upaketu, the unseen. These names are important because they encapsulate the way each of these demi-planets should be interpreted. But in order to understand that and understand why these particular demi-planets should be interpreted in the ways that they are, let's move on and discuss where they are to be found. Wherever your sun is, or wherever the sun is, if you go forward in the zodiac 133 degrees and 20 minutes, you will bump into this invisible semi-planet called Dhuma, the smoky one. That's where it is. It is always 133 degrees, 20 minutes from wherever the sun is. Then if you look exactly across the sky from that point, you'll be looking at the spot where another invisible Upagraha is hiding. That one is Indrachapa, the king's bow. If you continue forward from Dhuma until you get to 226 degrees and 40 minutes from the sun, you will bump into another invisible demi-planet. This one is Vyatipat, the contemptuous one. And then if you turn and you look 180 degrees away from where you are, you'll be looking at the spot where the 4th demi-planet is hiding. That one's Parivesh, the encircler. And the 5th of these Upagrahas, you have to go all the way to 330 degrees from the sun, and you'll find them sitting there invisibly, Upaketu, the unseen. So the important thing about this class of demi-planets is that their positions are all affixed to the position of the sun. They're welded to the position of the sun. So they move in lockstep with the sun. So because of that, you can kind of think of them as like aspects of the sun's special aspected points. Now I'd like to explain why these demi-planets pick these particular points as their hiding spots. Draw a trine from the sun, and then draw a semi-trine from the sun. Now notice where these demi-planets are situated in relation to these auspicious points. Each one is exactly 13 degrees and 20 minutes from its nearest auspicious point. That number, 13 degrees 20 minutes, should ring a bell because it's the length that the moon travels in one day. So it's one significant unit of space. It's a lunar unit. Each Upagraha is exactly one lunar unit from its nearest auspicious point. This fact is what makes the smoky one, Dhuma, the smoky one, and what makes Vyatipat, the contemptuous one, contemptuous. Let me explain that. If you think carefully about Duma, the smoky one, he's sitting one lunar unit past the 5th house point from the sun. So he's moving from the 5th into the 6th position. The 5th position signifies intellect, but the 6th position signifies confusion. Moving from the 5th to the 6th is the point where we're losing clarity and gaining confusion. Hence, the characteristic of this Upagraha is smoky. Now let's take a look at Vyatipat, the contemptuous. Vyatipat is sitting one lunar day away from the 9th point. So Vyatipat is moving from the 8th into the 9th. And that's why he's described as contemptuous. Because the 8th house is very scrutinizing and critical. Whereas the 9th house, all the people that we should believe in and trust, all of our role models. So this Upagraha is very overly critical. Now take a look at Indrachapa, the king's bow. This is one lunar unit past the 11th. So it's at the point where we've moved from the 11th house towards the 12th. So we're moving from prosperity to loss, and it's described as Indrachapas, the king's bow. So what does it signify? It signifies the effort to protect what you have against inevitable loss, which is what Indra is constantly trying to do. It's the waste of our efforts and our energy and our resources on trying to ensure ourselves against the inevitable decline of things. Now let's look at the 4th of these invisible demi-planets, Parivesh. Where's Parivesh? It's one lunar unit away from the 3rd point. So it's at the spot where the 2nd house is transferring into the 3rd. The 2nd house signifies family and cooperation with units. But the 3rd house signifies independence and individuality. So the demi-planet situated in between these 2 points is called Parivesh, which means encircled, where you feel enclosed or constrained. And it represents having your freedom being limited, feeling like you lack mobility, or feeling that you lack the ability to achieve or be what you want to be or achieve. As a side note, one other thing you can notice about these 4 demi-planets is that another way to look at it is that they're at the points where all the houses are shifting towards apaklama. So they're the points at which the weakness is starting to set in. We still haven't analyzed the 5th invisible demi-planet, which is Upaketu, the unseen. This one is actually quite simple. It's just sitting at 330 degrees from the sun, which means it's sitting exactly at the 12th house cusp. And that's why it's called the unseen, because the 12th house signifies invisibility or difficulty in seeing what's there. And so it is interpreted in the sense of unseen or unexpected things coming, like surprise attacks. Another way of looking at the points occupied by the demi-planets close to the sun, Upaketu is at more or less the limit of Mercury's orbit, and hence it signifies the extent to which our intellect can go. So it's like the boundary of our intellect. At this point, we don't know what's beyond it. So it's called Upaketu. It signifies the things that you're not aware of. And also, by the way, these other 2 points, the king's bow and the encircler, they're basically at the limit of Venus's orbit. And so they signify the limit of prosperity, or the end of prosperity, the end of ease. So now you know where these demi-planets are, where these 5 invisible demi-planets sit, and you also know what they symbolize. Let's try to put it a little bit closer to home by showing you an example of how you would use them in interpretation. Let's use the example of how we would interpret any of these 5 demi-planets if it would happen to be conjoined with Mars. So let's take the case of Dhuma. Dhuma is a smoky one. It represents being confused and therefore being more easily tricked or deceived. So if it would happen to be conjoined Mars in a chart, what would you interpret? It's actually simple. You are confused about Mars. And the only difficult part is to flesh that out accurately. So it means stuff like you're confused about fighting, and you're confused about competing and rivals, and you're not really sure what's a fight and what's not a fight, or what's a rival, who's a rival and who's not a rival, who's a friend, who's a foe. Let's look at Vyatipat now, the contemptuous one. So this one symbolizes attacking, too much attacking, and then therefore too much counterattacking, or in other words, too much hating, and therefore too much counter-hate. So if this Vyatipat, the contemptuous, is conjoined with Mars, how would you interpret it? The person is very overly aggressive. They unnecessarily aggravate the hatred or competition from other people. Their behavior just provokes other people. It could also swing exactly the opposite way, and it could mean a hatred of Mars. So you have to look at all the rest of the factors to decide which one you're going to favor, which of these interpretations you would favor. If it's hatred of Mars, then it's like so much criticism of martial things, of masculine things, etc. And therefore you get that kind of backlash from those things would hate you back. Let's take a look at Indrachapa, the king's bow. This demi-planet signifies wasting your resources trying to prolong the inevitable. If you have Mars conjoined with the king's bow, then it means that you're really paranoid about accidents. You're really worried about attacks. And you're actually overprotecting and over-insuring against those things. Now let's take a look at Upaketu. This demi-planet is about unseen things. And so it has to do with dealing with problems at the disadvantage of not really foreseeing that they were coming. So if Mars is conjoined with Upaketu, it's sort of the opposite of if Mars is conjoined with Indrachapa. If Mars was conjoined with Indrachapa, you're overly paranoid about accidents. And so you're wasting time on insurance and preparation that just you don't need to. But if Mars is conjoined Upaketu, the unseen, it's the opposite. You're underprepared and underinsured. There's so many enemies and accidents that you could have foreseen if you would have taken a little time to think about it. Finally, we have Parivesh, the demi-planet of being encircled or encased. If Mars is conjoined with the encircler, again, it's just simple, really. The only difficult thing is fleshing out the simple interpretation. The simple interpretation is you're encased by Mars. You're limited. Your freedom is restricted by Mars. So Mars represents enemies. So there's a lot of enemies if Mars is conjoined with Parivesh. Mars represents violence, war, anger. So you would be subject to, surrounded sort of. So you might be in the middle of a war situation or a violent situation. Mars also represents military and police and so forth. So you could be breaking the law if Mars is conjoined tightly with Parivesh. And therefore you could be limited by the police. Now that you see how you would interpret Mars with any of these demi-planets, you could just use the same basic template for any other planet's conjunction with any of these demi-planets, or similarly any house cusp conjunction. But I think it would be helpful to flesh this out a little bit more. So let me give you a look at how I would interpret Upagrahas in a specific chart. Here's my chart. My sun is here at like 4 degrees of Leo, and therefore these Upagrahas have these positions, because the positions of these invisible demi-planets are directly tied to the position of the sun. Now let's start by taking a look at where my house cusps are. What I recommend is using a whole sign house system. And so the cusp of the house is not the edge of the house. The cusp of the house is the defining point, or the most sensitive point within the house. And it is exactly the same as whatever the ascendant degree is. So this ascendant degree is something like 25-ish. And so the cusp of every house is at about 25 degrees of that house, of that sign. So looking at the house cusps in relation to these invisible demi-planets, we see that Vyatipat, the contemptuous, is pretty close to the third house cusp. And therefore, we would want to note that and interpret that. We would also notice that Parivesha, the encircler, the limiter, is pretty close to the ninth house cusp. So we would also want to save that as a note to be interpreted. The rest of the demi-planets are sort of kind of doing things, but not really too notably. You want these demi-planets to be in a fairly tight conjunction with something before you really pay too much attention to them. So you might say, well, the sixth house cusp looks like it's surrounded by some demi-planets. You might say the 12th house cusp looks like it has an aspect of Duma affecting it. But it's really not going to be front and center. It doesn't have that much of a spotlight because these conjunctions are not that tight. Now let's put some other planets from my chart on, draw them onto this page. The moon, here it is in early Gemini. It's not particularly close to any Upagraha, any demi-planets. So we don't have to interpret anything special. Same thing with Mercury. It's super close to the 8th house cusp, but it has no real tight conjunction with any demi-planets. Venus, however, is very close to Parivesha, the encircler. So we also want to interpret that, make a note of it. If we continue on, Mars is real close to the Sun, but that means it's not that close to any of these invisible demi-planets. Jupiter is real close to the 10th house cusp, but it's not close to any of the demi-planets, and Saturn is real close to the 5th house cusp, but again, it's kind of free of influence from any of the demi-planets. Also, the nodes are sort of out of the way in relation to these demi-planets. So what we wind up with after parsing these demi-planets on this chart is a list of 3 things that really should be interpreted. And actually, the second one and the third one should be woven together. The fact that Venus is conjoined with Parivesha and the 9th house cusp is conjoined with Parivesha should be taken as one whole. So we really have 2 things to interpret. As for the third house with Vyatipat, the contemptuous, what would that mean? It's very similar to how you would interpret Vyatipat with Mars. It's just too contemptuous. Get dislike from people because of being too quick and assertive and rash about how you criticize or how you dislike things. You might be shaking your head like, how could that match this guy? But some of you might have been around this channel for a while. You might know. That might ring a bell. And then the second group, the 9th house and Venus being affected by Parivesha, the encircler. Parivesha means things are going to be restricted and freedom is going to be limited. Freedom is going to be limited by what or in relationship to what? In relationship and by the 9th house and Venus. So Venus mostly has to do with pleasures, and the 9th house mostly has to do with religion and philosophy and ethics. So with this configuration of Venus and the 9th house cusp conjoined the encircling demi-planet, you interpret that this person limits themselves or feels restricted by or is restricted by their morals, their ethics, and they feel restriction particularly in luxuries and pleasures. So maybe they lived in ashrams as a monk. This is very foretelling of such a lifestyle, because you would be foregoing Venus for the sake of 9th house. So that's a specific example of how you read the invisible demi-planets on a particular chart. What you can take away from this and apply to your own chart is look for where the points in your chart really closely conjoin any of these demi-planets, and then make the interpretations of only those close conjunctions, and do it simply. You just take the keyword about the demi-planet and the keyword about the thing that's being conjoined, put it together, and then think kind of carefully about how you flesh that out into actual sentences and concepts. So now I think you know what you need to know about the invisible demi-planets, the Upagraha. But there's a whole nother category. There's 5 more that are described as periodic or kalavela. What's the difference between the periodic and the invisible demi-planets? Like I said in the beginning of the video, they're both invisible. But the periodic demi-planets have a weirdness about how they move. All the other points move from point 1 to point 2 sequentially. Maybe sometimes they go forward, maybe sometimes they go backwards, but they always go sequentially. These Kalavela, or periodic appearances, these demi-planets, they appear in one point on one day, and then they disappear and move to a totally different point on another day. And furthermore, even on any day, during the day they're in one spot, and at night they flip over to a totally different spot. So their movement is very unusual. They appear and disappear based on the time of day, and therefore they're called Kalavela, or periodic is the only way I could think of translating it. Here are the 5 periodic demi-planets. Kala, which means time. Mrityu, which means death or the end. Ardha Prahara, which means like half an hour or the middle time. Yama Gantaka, which means the time in between hours or the joining time. And Gulika, which just means like a head. So it could mean the beginning, or it could just mean like a head. But it's not too important that we understand the names, because unlike the invisible demi-planets, these periodic demi-planets have a direct relationship to regular planets. And the way we interpret them is very, very similar to the particular normal planet that they're associated with. So Kala is the demi-planet associated to the sun. Its appearance and disappearance has to do with the sun. Mrityu is connected with Mars. Ardha Prahara, or just Ardha for short, has to do with Mercury. Yamagantaka, or Yama for short, has to do with Jupiter. And Gulika has to do with Saturn. So this makes it sort of easy for us. We don't have to learn new symbolisms. We can just say Gulika is like another Saturn. Yama is like another Jupiter. Ardha is like another Mercury. Mrityu is like another Mars. But Kala, although its position is related to the sun, its interpretation is the same as Rahu. Now, although there are 5 periodic demi-planets, they are not equally significant. By far, Yama and Gulika, Jupiter's and Saturn's demi-planets, those are by far the most important of this group. So first, let's understand how you can figure out where these guys are, because it's difficult. So the way to know where these demi-planets are is based on the time of day or the time of night. So what we want to do is divide the day and the night into 8 equal portions. And we can call each portion a watch. So there's 8 watches in the day and there's 8 watches in the night. The first watch of the day begins at sunrise, and then after a while it changes to the second watch, and then the third watch, and by the time the fourth watch is over, it's midday. And then it continues through the watches, and by the time the day is over at sunset, that's the end of the 8th watch. Similarly, the night watches begin with the first one after sunset, and then the second night watch, third night watch, and midnight would be at the end of the 4th night watch, and the night would end at the end of the 8th with the next sunrise. Now, how do these watches correspond to what's on your watch? How do these time units correspond to modern time units? Well, they kind of don't. They don't have a fixed correspondence because we changed the way we tell time a couple of centuries ago when mechanical clocks became popular. But if you were on the equinox, on the equator, then the first watch of the day would begin at 6 o'clock in the morning, and the first watch of the night would begin at 6 p.m. The fourth watch of the day would end at 12 p.m., and the fourth watch of the night would end at 12 a.m. Each watch in between would last for an hour and a half, and so you would get these kind of borders for your clock of 8 watches. If you are anywhere other than the equator, and if it's any day other than the equinox, it will be slightly different. Because these watches expand and shrink with your latitude and longitude and with the sun's proximity to solstices, kind of similarly to how the houses expand and shrink in the dynamic systems like Placidus. So unfortunately, there is no fixed correlation between the time that is on your birth certificate and which watch of the day you were born, and you have to figure it out. Each watch is ruled by a particular planet, and the rulership of the watches is directly related to the rulership of the days of the weeks. Depending on the day of the week, the ruler of the first watch is different. If it's a Sunday, since Sunday belongs to the sun, then the ruler of the first watch is the sun. And then the rest of the watches go in order from there. But if it's a Monday, then the ruler of the first watch is the moon, and the rest go in order from there, and then the sun gets shifted over to the end at the 8th watch. As for the night watches, they don't just mirror the day watches. The ruler of the first night watch is the ruler of the 5th day watch. So if it's Sunday, then the ruler of the 5th watch of the day is Jupiter, and therefore Jupiter also rules the first watch of the night, and the rest of the night watches proceed in order from Jupiter's Thursday. Similarly, if it's Monday, then Venus owns the 5th watch of the day, and therefore owns the first watch of the night, and the rest of the night watches proceed in order from Venus's Friday. Now that you know which planet rules which watch on any particular weekday, you know what you need to know to be able to figure out where these periodic demi-planets are in the sky. All you need to do is put the demi-planet that's associated with the particular real planet in the watch that's ruled by that real planet. So Moon and Venus don't have any periodic Upagraha, so just remove them. And then you just put Kala where the sun's watch is, Mrityu where Mars's watch is, Ardha where Mercury's watch is, Yamaganta where Jupiter's watch is, and Gulika where Saturn's watch is. Now you know what time of the day these Upagrahas become active. But in order to use these Upagrahas in a natal chart, like your birth chart, you just need to translate that information into a zodiacal degree. And the way that's done is the principle that the Upagraha rises at the moment that its time becomes active. That's why its time becomes active at that time, because it's rising. So how do you figure out what the rising degree is at any particular time of day? Well, you just cast a chart for that time at that location. Okay, then how do you know what time to cast that chart for? Let me show you then how to do it step by step. To figure out the exact position of these periodic demi-planets, there's 4 steps that we need to do in preparation to get the key information that we need. And then we use that information in 3 steps per each demi-planet. So here's the 4 preparatory steps. It's not as difficult as it seems. First of all, we just need to know on the day that you were born, what weekday was it? What time did the sun rise? And what time did it set? Your astrology software quite likely tells you that information somewhere. If you can't find that, or if you don't have astrology software, or if you don't know where to go look for it, you can find the information on the internet too. For example, there's a site called suntoday.org. You can just type in your location of birth and your date of birth, and it will tell you the weekday and the sunrise and the sunset. So for example, for me, born July 27th, 1970 at 1938 in Bay Shore, New York, that was a Monday. And on that day, the sun rose at 5:46 a.m. and it set at 8:14 or 2014. That's the information that you need to be able to start figuring out where the demi-planets were on that day at that place. Once you know this, once you know the sunset and the sunrise times, you can figure out whether the birth was during the day or at night. So obviously, since I was born at 1938 and the sun didn't set till 2014, sure, I was born during the sunset, but it was during the day. Now, there's another way that the modern changes to our calendars and our clocks has kind of made this more difficult than it needs to be. We start a day now at midnight, but the natural clock has days starting at sunrise. So in astrology, days start at sunrise, but on calendars, days start at midnight, which is fine when you're using regular software because the software knows that. But when you're doing the steps by yourself, you might need to be aware of that. So if you were born, let's say on July 28th, 1970, at 1 o'clock in the morning, for the purpose of calculating these demi-planets, you're actually born on the 27th at night, not on the 28th in the morning. So keep that in mind. The third thing we want to know is, how long was this day? Or if I was born at night, how long was the night? Since I'm born during the day, I want to ask, if the sun rose at 5:46 and it's set at 8:14 p.m., how long did that day last? You just need to take out a pencil or look at a clock and figure that out. In this case, it's 14 hours and 28 minutes. So if you're born during the day, you just count the hours from the sunrise to the sunset. If you're born at night, you count the hours from the sunset to the sunrise of the next day. Once you know how long the day is, or the night, on the day or night that you were born, you can just divide that by 8, and you will find out how long each watch is. So in my case, each watch is 1 hour and 48 minutes and 30 seconds, or 108 minutes and 30 seconds. After having done these 4 steps, we have the 4 key infos that we need to have to know where the periodic demi-planets are. We know whether it's a day or night birth. For me, it's a day. We know what day of the week it was. For me, it's a Monday. We know what time the sun rose or set. Since I'm a day birth, the rising is important. So it's 5:46 a.m. And we know how long each watch was on that day. Now we'll take that information and use it for each of the 5 periodic demi-planets to figure out exactly where they are in the zodiac. Step 1, just figure out what was that planet's watch during that day or night on that particular weekday. So since I was born on Monday during the day, then Kala was the lord of the 8th watch, and Mrityu was the lord of the 2nd watch, and Arda was the lord of the 3rd watch, Yama of the 4th, and Gulika of the 6th. The next step is to multiply that by the length of the watch, so you can figure out when each watch started on a regular clock. Since I'm born during the day, we're going to add that to the sunrise. If you're born at night, then you add the multiplied watch length to the sunset. So with that, I can figure out that the 8th watch began at 1914 in Bayshore, New York on July 27th, 1970. The 2nd watch began at 9:23 in the morning. The 3rd watch began at 11:11 and 30 seconds, etc. Now we know the times that the watches began, and therefore we can know the ascendant at those times by just calculating the chart for that time at that place. So this tells me that when I was born, Kala was sitting at 14 degrees and 15 minutes of Capricorn. Mrityu, or death, was sitting at 13 degrees of Virgo. Ardha Prahara was sitting at 4 degrees of Libra, Yamaganta at 26 degrees of Libra, and Gulika at 8:49 of Sagittarius. I've shown you how to do this for my chart, but you can just follow these exact same steps to do it for your chart or anybody's chart. Once you know where these demi-planets are, I would encourage you to just write them onto the chart, draw them onto the chart, just put them at their actual degrees. So in this particular case, what the demi-planets are really showing us is, hey, you better pay attention to this 9th house on Venus, because not only is Pariveshti and circular affecting it, so is Mrityu, the end. 2 demi-planets are involved here with Venus in the 9th house. Another thing that jumps out is, hey, Yamaganta, Jupiter's demi-planet, is right next to Jupiter and the 10th house. We better interpret that too. When doing interpretations before jumping into specifics, it's very advisable to take a step back and get general feelings. So take a look at the chart without any demi-planets on it. The feeling your eye kind of naturally gives you about it is that it's 8th, 9th 8th house-ish, 9th house-ish, especially 8th house-ish. That's where the action is at. That's where the chart feels heavy. When you put the demi-planets on the chart and do the same kind of quick initial feeling about it, your focus shifts. So it doesn't leave the 8th house, but it shifts now to be focused more on the 9th house and to include the 8th and the 10th. And if you know how to interpret it, you will wind up with a more accurate, much more accurate depiction of this native myself than if you would just focus on the 8th house. And then, of course, you additionally have your specifics as well, like Venus has got a lot of conjunction with demi-planets. Jupiter has this exact conjunction with its own demi-planet. How do we make these interpretations? Let me walk you through the guidelines. It's not really difficult. The first thing to remember is that 2 of these demi-planets are much more significant than the other 3. The 2 most significant demi-planets are Yamaganta and Gulika. That's Jupiter's demi-planet and Saturn's demi-planet. Basically speaking, you can just use the keywords good and bad to aid you in your interpretation. And since Yamaganta is Jupiter's demi-planet, it's good. And since Gulika is Saturn's, it's bad. What kind of goodness, what kind of badness? We'll flesh that out in a second. But for now, that's where we want to start from. That's our first step. As for the other 3, they're supposed to be like half as significant. If you do, which doesn't mean they're insignificant if they're very closely conjoined with something. So the first of these 3 is Ardhaprahara, which is Mercury's demi-planet. So it's kind of just like Mercury. It could be good, it could be bad. It's in the middle. That's what Ardha means, actually, middle. So it tends to be good. But if it's conjoining something that's already bad for some other reason, then it amplifies the badness instead. Mrityu is Mars's demi-planet, and so it's basically bad. And similarly, Kala is Rahu's demi-planet, or it acts like Rahu, and so again, it's basically bad. So let me show you the example of how you would interpret Yamaganta, the good one, Jupiter's demi-planet, if it would conjoin the various houses. If you have Yamaganta in your first house, then that's good for everything, because the first house affects everything and how everything manifests. Now, when I say in your first house, it really doesn't mean just anywhere in your first house. If it is close to your ascendant, which is the first house cusp, then it's really significant. If it's far from your ascendant, then it's not that significant in the house. So similarly, if Yamaganta conjoins the second house cusp, that indicates good stuff for your second house. So what's your second house about? It's about speech and wealth and food. So it's good for health, it's good for prosperity, and good for speech. The second house speech means how able are you to converse with people and understand people and make yourself understood to people. If Yamaganta is conjoined to your third house cusp, well, that's just good for your third house. Third house represents your motives, your ambitions, and also your siblings or your peers. So Yamaganta conjoined to the third house is a person with good motives, a lot of motives, good motivation, and helpful peers, helpful siblings. If Yamaganta is conjoined your fourth house cusp, that's good for your fourth house. Your fourth house represents the comfort and peace that you have in your heart and your mind, and also the support that you get from your family and your culture. Yamaganta conjoined the fifth house cusp is good for the fifth house. And the fifth house is about how you can concentrate and come up with ideas. Yamaganta with the sixth house cusp is good for the sixth house, which is kind of complicated or double negative because the sixth house represents enemies and problems. So Yamaganta conjoined with the sixth house cusp is not really a place where you want it, because it's good for the enemies and it's good for the problems. It might mean you deal with enemies well and you deal with problems well, but 9 out of 10 times it means you are too generous or too lazy towards the enemies and towards the problems. If Yamaganta is conjoined the 7th house cusp, it's good for the 7th house. 7th house has to do with your social skills and how well you conduct your relationships. If Yamaganta is conjoined the 8th house cusp, well, that's good for your attractiveness because the 8th house cusp is what generates all your charisma and your vitality and your sexuality as well. Yamaganta conjoined the 9th house cusp is very good for 9th house things. So very good for your role models and the morality that you acquire from them. Yamaganta conjoined the 10th house cusp is very good for your karma, for your deeds. So it means you do actions which are moral, you do actions which are good, you do actions that benefit others. Yamaganta on the 11th house cusp is good for the 11th house. The 11th house represents luxury. And Yamaganta on the 12th house cusp is good for the 12th. So the 12th has to do with sexual pleasure or any kind of ecstatic, non-conventional pleasure. So it's good for spirituality, sexuality, sexual pleasure. And it's good for expenses, which 50-50 could mean maybe it means you give away a lot of money, or it might mean that you're good at spending so you can actually increase your savings. Now that we have this template for Yamaganta in all the 12 houses, you can really just reverse the template to get an idea of how Gulika should be interpreted in each of the 12 houses. So you just change the word good to the word bad, and then you understand Gulika in all the 12 houses. As for the other 3, Ardhaprahara basically is another Yama. So you just basically use the same list, but the effects are less pronounced. And it has a caveat of if the house is bad for some other reason, then the effect of Ardha will be bad, like Gulika instead of like Yamaganta. The remaining 2, Kala and Mrityu, they're just like Gulika, but they're not as intense. So this is a short list of how to interpret all 5 periodic demi-planets in any house. But this list is really relying on the simple terms good and bad. So let's flesh out what we mean by good and what we mean by bad, because it's not exactly the same for each demi-planet. So since Gulika is like Saturn, when it's Gulika causing the badness, then that badness means deficiency or harshness. So for example, if Gulika is in the 7th house, then we could say it's bad for the social skills. But we can specifically say the person is too harsh in how they deal and reciprocate with others. They get treated harshly because actually they're treating people harshly as well. And there's a deficit in the interactions. They don't like to interact with people. They feel kind of irritated or annoyed by interacting with people. Kala, on the other hand, we also just shorthand it as saying it's bad for X. But it's specifically bad in the same way that Rahu is bad for things. So that means chaos and instability and uncertainty and sudden changes. Kala conjoined the 7th house cusp is like Rahu conjoined the 7th house cusp. So there's just like instability, excess, uncertainty, and chaos in how you deal with people and relationships. Mrityu is like Mars, so its badness has to do with hostility and rivalry. There's too much hostility in how you deal with people, even your relationships, even your family members, even your spouse, etc. And there's too much rivalry involved in that. Now for the good planet, the good demi-planets, we have Yama. Yama is good, but it's good like Jupiter. So if Yama is conjoined the 7th house cusp, it's not just good for the social skills, it particularly means there's an abundance of social interactions and relationships. There's plenty of people to rely on. There's plenty of people to network with. There's plenty of people to have close relationships with. And there's wisdom involved in how you're doing that. You're exchanging wisdom with these people. You're dealing with them in good, moral, ethical, wise ways. And Ardha is also good for things. So if Ardha is conjoined the 7th house cusp, that's also good for the 7th house things like social skills, but it's not the same as Yama, really, because it's Mercury's demi-planet. So it has to do with having dexterity and intelligence. So with Ardha conjoined the 7th house cusp, the person is really good at business. The person is really good at commerce. They're very good at interacting with the world in a very detailed way, in a very careful way, in a very dexterous way, in a balanced way. Now I've explained how you interpret the periodic demi-planets in conjunction with the house cusps. Let's talk for a bit about how you would interpret them in conjunction with other planets. Honestly, it's just as simple. You just take a keyword, good or bad, and you apply that keyword towards whatever the planet represents. So if Yama conjoins the sun, that's good for your father. Or it's good for the things that the father provides, which is a sense of security and certainty and a sense of being able to rely on an authority figure. If Yama conjoins the moon, it's the same thing, but in relation to the mother, because the moon represents the mother. So it's good for the mother and everything that the mother provides, which is a sense of comfort and happiness and internal security. If Yama conjoins Mercury, then that's good for Mercury, since Mercury represents intelligence and dexterity and friendships. Then Yamaganta conjoined Mercury is very good for your intelligence. It's very good for your relationships and friendships, and it's very good for your skills in general. Yamaganta conjoined Venus is just as simple. It's very good for your spouse. It's very good for your luxuries. Yamaganta conjoined Mars is also just as simple. It's good for Mars. Mars represents your rivals and your siblings. So it means you know how to deal with rivals. You have rivals and siblings that are more cooperative than they are competitive. Yamaganta conjoined Jupiter means it's very good for the things that Jupiter represents. Well, Jupiter represents role models, parents, teachers, philosophies, religions. Similarly, Yamaganta conjoined Saturn is very good for what Saturn represents. So it's good for longevity and it's good for illness. I mean, it's good for health. As for the nodes, if Yamaganta conjoins Rahu, then it's good for poisonous things. So it means you don't get poisoned, but it also means you don't get infected by your interactions with things. You're able to let go of pain. You're able to let go of anger, etc. And similarly with Ketu, it's good for fires. So it means you're not subjected to accidents, which means also that it's good for intellect and planning. Now that we know how Yamaganta should be interpreted in conjunction with any planet, you can just expand this, just like we did with the house cusps, and understand how Gulika should be interpreted. Just reverse the keyword good to bad. Then you understand how Gulika is interpreted in relation to any particular planet, and then the other three just fall into place. So to summarize all the interpretive keywords here, Gulika, Kala, and Mrityu will always have a bad effect on whatever they conjoin. But the badness of Gulika has to do with deficit and harshness. The badness of Kala has to do with excess and instability. And the badness of Mrityu has to do with hostility and rivalry. Conversely, Yama will always have a good effect on whatever it conjoins, and Ardha will usually have a good effect. But a Yama's good effect has to do with abundance and wisdom, and Ardha's good effect has to do with dexterity and skill and IQ. Let's not forget the invisible demi-planets. To review those interpretive keywords, Dhamma always has to do with confusion. Vyatipat always has to do with discord and the disgrace that's involved in being discordant. Parvesha always has to do with confinement, or limitation. Indrachapa has to do with struggle and paranoia. And Upaketu has to do with surprises and shocks. Two more important things for me to tell you before I should end this video. And these are really important, actually. The Upachaya houses, 3, 6, and 11, are much more forgiving towards the bad demi-planets. Especially the invisible ones, Duma, Vyatipad, Parivesh, Indrachapa, and Upaketu. So, for example, any one of those 5 in the 3rd house actually causes good effects, like bravery, good effects of the 3rd house, bravery, ambitiousness, etc. 6th house, strength, imperviousness, and so forth. 11th house is temperament, good temperament. The other thing that's very, very important is that till now, the impression that you're probably getting from this video and the way I've explained it is that Gulika is just bad and Yamaganta is just good, etc., etc., etc. But actually, these demi-planets are subjected to dignity, just like normal planets are. And dignity affects their mood and how good or bad they're actually going to act at that given moment in that particular chart. So how do you calculate the dignity of a demi-planet? It's all based upon the dignity and prominence of their lord. So if Gulika is in Capricorn and Saturn is in Libra in the 10th house, then that Gulika is fantastic because it's in a fantastic dignity. And it's not going to have bad effects. It's going to have very, very good effects and protect the native from all the bad effects that it would have. So that's the final thing that's very, very important to bear in mind, is that we apply a consideration of dignity to the demi-planets based on the dignity and prominence of their lords. Prominence means whether or not they're in kendras or konas, angles or trines. To be in angles or trines increases their prominence. So thank you for watching all the way till now. I wonder how many times you had to pause or take notes or rewind. I believe that if you got to this point, you've completed a study of Upagrahas, which is very complete. And you can really use this information in your astrology, whether it's a practice or a hobby. I am very seriously considering making a report for you on how to interpret your demi-planets so you don't have to do all these steps. Let me know in the comments how much that excites you or disinterests you, so I can get a kind of a thermometer on what kind of priority I should give that project. If you want to see the reports that I already have available to see what kind of quality would be involved in this Demi-Planet report, go to victikara.com and click to the readings, and you'll see these reports here. I'll give you some information about the reports that are currently available. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, victikara.com, and click readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarahabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding.